What's up, guys? It's good to be with you. We are beginning a brand new series tonight. Everyone wants to know what's going to happen in the future. And lucky for us, the Bible actually gives us some answers. That's what this new series is going to be all about, understanding what we can expect in the future. And so we are going to answer a series of questions throughout this series. And before we get into some of the specifics, I want to answer a few general questions that we might ask about understanding the end times, what is going to happen. And so the first question that we might ask is, why should we care about the end times? Why should we care what's going to happen in the future? Well, there are a few answers to this that I think will be helpful. The first is that the end times reveal God's ultimate plan for his creation. And in addition to that, they also reveal something important about God's character, about who he is. Secondly, understanding the end times gives us hope. It tells us that God is going to redeem this broken world that we all live in. See, in Christianity, the end is really only the beginning. Thirdly, the end times give us warning that God is going to eliminate evil. And those who do not enter into eternity with the fullness of God's blessing will enter into eternity separated from his goodness. And that should be a warning for us that some people will experience God's wrath. And lastly, it teaches us that we always live in light of revelation. And what I mean by that is that we always live based on what we think is going to happen in the future. So, for example, if you knew that you had a sporting event at the end of this week, how would that impact the way that you are going about your week right now? What if that sporting event was maybe a state championship game? That would probably mean that you would prepare right now for that event later. Maybe it would impact the way that you eat. Maybe it would impact the way that you train. So we always live in light of revelation, what we believe about the future. And the same should be true with what God teaches us in his word about the future. Now, the second question we might ask more generally is, can we know anything about the end times? Can we know anything about what God says is going to happen in the future? Well, there are three things that I would say to that. The first is that we can know for certain general principles. We know that there is going to be a time of tribulation. We know that Jesus is going to come back. We know that God is going to redeem and restore our broken world. Secondly, we can know loosely particular circumstances. We know that there is going to be an antichrist, that there is going to be world leaders who oppose the works of Jesus and the Holy Spirit. And yet we can know doubtfully specific details. We don't know exactly who the Antichrist is going to be. We don't know the day or the hour that Jesus is going to come back. In Matthew 24:36, Jesus actually says, about that day, meaning his return, or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. So we can know for certain general principles, we can know loosely particular circumstances, and we can know doubtfully specific details. Tonight, we are going to be focusing on two key aspects of the future, the end times, specifically the millennium and the tribulation. Now, if you have no idea what those words mean, that's great. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. But before we get started, why don't you take a few minutes to read a couple Bible passages and answer some questions with your group? Welcome back, guys. So before we get started in talking about the millennium and the tribulation, you're going to see a QR code appear on the screen. And what I'd like you to do, if you have a phone, is you can scan that. And this is actually going to take you to a really helpful infographic about the different perspectives of the end times. I hope that you'll be able to reference this infographic as I go through the lesson that will sort of help you visualize what exactly I'm talking about, because honestly, we're going to be talking about a lot of things. It's going to be a little bit like drinking from a fire hose. So this infographic will be super helpful. And if you prefer not to look at it as we go through the lesson, then please make sure you check it out after the lesson. To sort of help you sort it all out in your head. So we're going to begin by talking about the millennium. Now, quite simply, the millennium is the 1,000-year reign of Christ that is mentioned in Revelation 20. Now, as you read, according to this passage, Satan will be thrown into the abyss for 1,000 years so that he can no longer deceive the nations. And during this time, Christians will come to life and reign with Christ. They will rule with Christ. And after this 1,000-year period, the devil will be released, and then he will prepare his followers for a final battle with Christ. And as you can see from the infographic, the millennium is really what divides Christians into three general camps as far as end time perspectives. This is where we get the terms amillennial, postmillennial, and premillennial. Now we're going to talk a little bit about each of those so that we understand each of those perspectives. Now, premillennialists believe that Jesus will return in bodily form before the millennium. That's where we get the word pre-millennium. They believe that when Jesus comes back, he's going to set up a kingdom here on earth during that time, before the final judgment. And then Satan will be released, Jesus will defeat him, and the new heaven and earth will be instituted. This is a more literal way of reading Revelation chapter 20, that there will be a 1,000-year reign of Christ here on the earth before Satan is finally defeated and the new heaven and earth come. Now, amillennialists and postmillennialists are very similar. They both believe that the 1,000-year reign of Christ is a spiritual reign of Christ, and that it isn't a literal 1,000 years. That just designates a very long time. That it's a spiritual reign of Christ that began when he actually ascended to the Father after he was resurrected, and when he sat down at the Father's right hand. They think that this is what is happening right now during the church age, that Christ is reigning from heaven. But here's where those two perspectives differ. So postmillennialists believe that society will continue to improve during the church age due to the church's positive influence on society, essentially creating a kingdom type of society here on earth with Christ reigning from heaven. Amillennialists, on the other hand, do not believe society will improve. They believe the church will thrive in a spiritual way while even being persecuted in a physical way. Both perspectives believe that Satan getting thrown into the abyss is a symbolic way of saying that Satan cannot ultimately stop the purposes of the church, that the church is able to spread to the nations. Now, each of the three perspectives that we mentioned, amillennialism, postmillennialism, and premillennialism, also differ on what is referred to in verses 5 and 6 of Revelation 20. This refers to the first resurrection. Premillennialists believe that this resurrection is a physical resurrection, since the millennium is a physical rule by a physical Christ here on the earth. That people will bodily rise from the dead during that time to reign with Christ before Satan is released. Postmillennialists and amillennialists believe that this is a spiritual resurrection, that those who die rise to reign with Christ in heaven, that's what happens right now when a believer dies. For them, then, the second resurrection is when people are physically raised from the dead and meet Christ when he comes physically to the earth to judge the earth. Now, I know that's a lot, so go ahead and take another minute to stop this video and discuss a few more questions with your group. So now we need to ask, how does the tribulation fit into the three perspectives that we just discussed about the end times? Well, the tribulation comes from Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Revelation chapter 7, especially verse 14. The word tribulation basically means a time of great trouble or suffering. The tribulation is therefore a period that is defined by great trouble or suffering. There is the presence of the Antichrist or Antichrists during the time of the tribulation. These are people or a person who is opposed to the work of Christ and who deny the Father and the Son. You can read a little bit more about the Antichrist and Antichrists in 1 John 2, 18 through 22, as well as in 2 Thessalonians. So we're going to ask, when will the tribulation occur? This time of struggle and suffering. The answer is, we don't know for sure. This is one of those areas that's a little bit gray in the Bible. There are three different views about the time of the tribulation. The first is what we call preterism. This means that it occurs in the past or occurred in the past. People who are preterist believe that the tribulation happened during the lifetime of the early disciples, and it culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, thus helping to confirm the establishment of the church as God's people. Preterists would also believe that the Emperor Nero was the Antichrist, and that the Antichrist doesn't refer to a future person that is to come. There's also the classical view of the tribulation. People who hold to a classical view believe that the ongoing suffering that God's people experience throughout history is the tribulation, and that the Antichrist is symbolic of evil figureheads, people that will pop up at different times throughout history that contribute to this tribulation period. Some believe that there is going to be an ultimate Antichrist towards the end of the tribulation before Jesus comes back. This is the classical view of the tribulation. There's also the dispensational view. Dispensational means a system of order of different periods of time. They believe that the tribulation is a specific time in the future of increased suffering, either with or without God's people, depending on their view of the rapture and when Christians are taken out of the world. And they believe that the Antichrist is one literal person that is to come in the future. And so, those are the different views of the tribulation and how they sort of fit into those three overarching views of the end times. And so we need to ask ourselves, what do we take away from this talk on the millennium and the tribulation? Is it all just interesting theories and interpretations and speculations? And what about this can and should actually penetrate to our hearts and affect the way that we live now? Well, there's one thing that I'd like us to remember, and that is that the tribulation is always connected to the millennium. No matter what specific view you hold, whether you believe it happens before or during the millennium, the tribulation is always connected to the millennium. And here's what I mean by that. The tribulation is the worst of times. It symbolizes hardship for the people here. But it brings out the best in God's people. That there's something about hardship that produces something that is beautiful and lasting in the people of God. See, the church shines most brightly in the dark. Jesus says that the very gates of hell cannot stand against the church. And this should give us a lot of hope and encouragement. So no matter what the future has in store, we can be hopeful that no matter how bad things get, nothing can stop Christ and his church. And that the hardship purifies the church. That we are a pure bride who are waiting for the groom to come. That we might be in relationship with him for all of eternity. So, guys, I am praying for you guys. I hope that this lesson was helpful. And I'm excited to see you guys next week.